guys, it's Miss Binion, and we're on World War II flip video 4. We're going to have a couple more flip videos after this one because World War II has a lot of information. We'll be talking about Learning Target 6.6, discuss the impact of the war on America's minorities, including African Americans and women. Learning Target 6.7, explain how the war impacted American Homefront. And Learning Target 6.8, discuss the advancement of technology and use of resources in America during World War II. Make sure you're keeping up with these videos, especially with things such as snow days. We want to make sure that we are on it. Okay, so if you'll remember last class, we had the attack of Pearl Harbor that we talked about, and FDR's war message declaring war on Japan and ultimately Germany. And this was where he talked about a date which will live in history. Okay, so some things that you didn't know about while the Japanese and Germans were we were fighting them on land and in the sea, they did try to attack the U.S. mainland in a lot of different ways. For example, these were Japanese balloon bombs, and they floated to the west coast, and I think they let 9,000 go, only 1,000 made it, and it only killed 6 people. So it killed 6 picnickers in Oregon. So that's something you probably haven't heard about, but it is one way that the Japanese tried to attack mainland U.S. So the War Powers Act is something new as well, so you need to write that down. It gave the president sweeping powers to conduct during the war. It also gave him power to censor all incoming and outgoing communications. He appointed a new executive news director for censorship, and basically the media had to regulate itself, and they couldn't really talk about things that were in the war. Magazines that sometimes included adult content were considered obscene, and Esquire magazine successfully sued the Postal Service to allow for their distribution in the mail. So basically this is he's trying to get more power so he can control things during wartime, which was necessary at the time. Awesome. Okay, so other things that occur, new recruits in the military. Over 60,000 people enlisted after Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. had found themselves overwhelmed because before it, we didn't have a big, strong army. There was lots of shortages of people. The army had to, they trained them, they didn't have enough rifles, so they trained them with broomsticks. They trained them with rocks instead of grenades, and trucks rather than armored vehicles. So first, when they went through the training facility, they had to make sure that they didn't have smallpox, typhoid, or any other diseases that they could encounter overseas. And they also had to have good vision and had to have good teeth. So they had a higher level of education. They were put in the officer candidacy school, and the Army segregated by race, but they did not group them by region or social class. They mixed them together. Which is pretty cool. So they just need to get on that segregation board. The first war that we fight that will be desegregated is the Korean War. Okay, so other things going on at home is this is George C. Marshall, who is one of your vocab words. On the day that World War II began, General George C. Marshall asked for $657 million to help increase the size of the Army because he could see that this was coming. The president agreed to most of it, and by the time France surrendered, the Congress had given the military about $9 billion. Okay, women in the war effort. With most of the men gone, the women had to take over many jobs. The image of Rosie the Riveter became really commonplace as women soon became the backbone of American industry. Other women sought more active roles, and they actually joined specially created women's units in the armed forces. They were in the WACs, the WAVES, the SPARs, and I'm going to show you what all those are. They also served as drivers, clerks, communication officers, pilots, and nurses. So there were 30 nurses that were killed in action during World War II as well. The other thing I want to say about this, it says it altered family life. There was a couple of things that came with this. The divorce rate increased, and juvenile delinquency among females increased. Alcoholism among women also grew, and women had to uproot themselves and their families to relocate to areas where they could work. And so this is a new generation of what they call latchkey kids, who frequently find themselves without parental guidance or supervision because their parents are helping in the war effort. Okay, but this war wouldn't have been successful without women. So the WACS, the Women's Army Corps, is basically it's a military service that the girls were recruited into, and they contribute to the war effort by performing 200 non-combat jobs, including switchboards, driving staff cars, and sorting mail. Basically, this frees the men up for combat. You have the WAVES, which is the Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, and this is the Navy program for it. They do not serve overseas or in combat areas, but they did, like the same thing, nurses, clerical work, communication jobs, same thing as the WACs. The WASPs were the Air Force, and they were the service pilots. And what's cool about them is that they were pilots, and they performed non-combat flight duties, and this freed the male pilots for combat missions. So these were all really important so that women held these jobs, so it allowed more men to go overseas and fight. Not only did women enlist in the military, but they also worked in the private sector as well. The shortage of male workers are going to lead to factories needing workers. The majority of women working in defense plants, though, earned much less than their male counterparts. Though many used to working as homemakers without pay accepted lower salaries without question. They also grew victory gardens, which we have talked about in World War I, and this is just an example of what they're making, and those were for the attack bombers, which is pretty cool. This is Rosie the Riveter. You've probably seen her before. She's a symbol of the working woman during the war. It basically says through the famous, it shows that women can help achieve victory through this "we can do it" attitude, that the women are the ones picking up the slack back at home. And this is just propaganda to kind of help women get on board. This is actually based on an actual factory worker. Her name was Rose Will Monroe, and they say that she likely inspired the character. She was a riveter at Michigan's Willow Run Aircraft Factory, and so, like I said, this went out, and this original painting later sold at an auction for $5 million. All right, which brings us to the Office of War Information. Okay, this was established in 1942, and basically it's goes back to the same thing with the War Powers Act. It worked to promote patriotism through various means, so posters, propaganda films, radio shows, anything that they could do to get people excited about the war. They also they're part of the people who helped recruit the women to work in the defense industry. All right, here's some more propaganda posters. So kind of look at those because we are going to go over those in class. So also part of this as well is the 1940s movies that feature films included war themes. So if you go back and you look at the 1940s, there's a lot of movies about war. And they're all kind of propaganda based. They had to be approved. These movies during this time had to be approved for the war, and the government would come and see what the movie was about, because if it was anti-war, then they couldn't release it. Some films, like Casablanca, showed the Nazis as villains. In Flying Tigers, and they were expendable. The Japanese were seen terrible. So these films kind of focused on the Nazis and the Japanese. And one of your favorite characters, probably, Sherlock Holmes, in Tarzan, battled the Nazis in these movies. Okay, so how do they get this all to happen? So Roosevelt, like I said, with the War Powers Act, kind of expanded what he was doing, and it's Dr. Win the War replaced Dr. New Deal. So many civilian industries converted to war production. So this meant that the factories had to be retooled and completely reworked. They needed manpower, both male and female, to replace the workers who left. For example, there was one instance of a factory in Detroit that was selling cars on Friday, and then over the weekend they closed, and then by Monday they were building ships. Okay? So the Axis powers kind of underestimate American production power, that this can happen. They didn't really realize that we were going to shut all the factories and businesses down and convert them to war production. This is going to help new industries emerge and make America's output it's going to increase. So, for example, the Japanese-controlled territory contained most of the world's supply of rubber. In response, the U.S. built nearly 50 rubber plants across the country. By the war's end, the U.S. was the largest importer of rubber. So I would write that down as an example of a new industry that emerged during World War II. Okay, this is Ford. So Henry Ford, he built B-24 Liberator bombers in his factory. and it's the world's largest factory under one roof. They made 14 aircraft per day, which is blowing my mind. So the War Production Board ensured that the military had the resources it needed and directed industrial output, prohibited non-essential business activities. So really, basically, this is going to lead to scrap drives. And scrap drives encourage collection of waste and scrap so that they can go back and they can use them for things like planes and all those kinds of things. Okay. So here is some propaganda for scrap drives. Awesome. So the Truman Committee, created to expose waste and fraud in the defense industry, Truman personally inspected factories and military installations, and this is going to save taxpayers millions of dollars so that there's no corruptness in the fact that a lot of these factories went over to defense building instead of defense production, instead of making just the products that they had been making. And the U.S. spent about $321 billion, which is more than $3 trillion today. Our national debt increased, and more Americans were required to pay income taxes. And they had to raise taxes so that we could pay for the war. Okay, and lastly, a lot of ways that they financed this was the war bonds. They used to help finance the war, just like in World War I. They sold 185 billion war bonds. So remember, you could buy a $100 war bond, and then they take that money and use that for the war, and then you get a high interest rate back on that. And here are some of the propaganda for war bonds during during World War II. If you remember, we had some from World War I. All right, that's it for today. Make sure you've got these down and you're ready to take a quiz. I'll see you guys in class.